We four limped back across border to our native land cold October. Blows Dad's wallet worn thin, stop in Oroville, I no future. Out of gas plans now long over. No jobs but digging rotten apples off frozen ground vinegar bound. Pay $6 nights in one room Alaska Highway View Hotel, doomed. Daily uncut bologna by the pound. 3 cold sandwiches per day. Can't get ahead enough to onward go, people here so odd and cold. As Dad stare out dirty window, no plan, no hope, nowhere prepared. Little brother and I earn dead apple money, a little, yet can't keep a dime. Dad growls, now give me Mom's 2. Desperate quarrels, Dad mentions booze. Mom's heart sunk, worn out time. Weeks pass our gray empty souls. Exhausted parents, little me tries to console, but no way to speak. Write commands to androids slowing to rust, no more goals to end size. Till one day, old rooster Hungarian man in trumps, crusty, loud, and bold. You any kind of a real cowboy? Of my old daddy demands unknown. All my life yours, Dad mumbles, sold. Tries Dad for a week, ancient wiry rooster, offers and he jumps at pay. Mom, brother, me, in hotel room, anxiously awaiting hired daddy, said, full time, always stayed from that day. The Okanagan Valley, where the Gandhis eventually found a new home on another cattle ranch, is situated in a narrow valley of hydro-sculpted and shattered basalt mountains. At a distance, these mountains look like giant piles of rounded boulders. Ancient glaciers moved and melted tall, powerful waterfalls that washed most of the topsoil away from all the surrounding mountains long before any humans lived. The Simon Ranch spreads out over thousands of acres of the verdant foothills along the Canadian border, several miles above the small town in the valley. The Gandhi family moved into an older house on the Simon Ranch. They marveled at the land, the more than 1,500 cattle, and the abundance of game on the ranch. There were herds of hundreds of deer, many pheasant, some elk, and all living right on the ranch. The ranch is located several miles from the town, high up in the hills. The 2 boys were enrolled in grade school, where they continued for 2 years. Mrs. Fernandez, Steve's Spanish teacher, showed up at the ranch one weekend. Steve was surprised at the time, and only many years later did he understand how much courage of personal fortitude it had taken for her to venture out of the little town of Oroville, her chosen point of exile. She spoke a few words of Spanish to Steve's father. Steve couldn't make out a word of it, so thought, wow, Dad will not understand a word of that. To his surprise, after a few seconds, Joe answered back fluently. In shock, Steve watched as Mrs. Fernandez and his old dad had a long, perfectly fluent conversation in Spanish. Steve hadn't known his father knew any Spanish. Joe certainly never spoke a word of Spanish in their home life. Steve stood staring at them, bewildered and doubly shocked. The Spanish teacher clearly dug Steve's dad. Most women did. He revealed quite a bit about herself that day, both in Spanish and directly to Steve in English, whenever he complained that he did not understand. She told the story of her life, how she had been a carefree 17-year-old rich kid, daughter to a top general in the army of Argentina. Then in the 1950s, a coup that ousted all the ruling class ended all of that. She angrily stated that she was barely able to get out with her life. Most of her family were killed. She had lived in the USA since being granted asylum there in 1957. She had to take a series of English as a second language ESL courses. Then, as an unexpected solitary life drifted her forward, some 16 years later, she had become a Spanish teacher. It became clear to Steve that she was fighting depression and regrets. Still, she had to work as a language teacher just to pay rent, afford food and gasoline for the little car that she could barely drive. She would usually pay random people a few dollars to drive her to and from the store, instead of driving herself. Joe explained to her that most of his knowledge of Spanish came from a close friendship with an old Mexican-American he called Old Zino. She said she could tell he learned from an older Mexican. "Because your strong Jalisco accent. That friend of yours, he was from northern Mexico, correct?" she inquired. Yes, he was. Actually, he lived most of his life in New Mexico and Colorado. But I understand both states were part of Old Mexico for several hundred years before that. He taught me to herd sheep and to drink tequila. Joe replied with a big loose smile on his face. Of course, I don't do either of those things anymore, he added. In 1971, Steve had his first encounter with recreational drugs that he had oft heard fearful tales of, but which he had never seen in person, namely cannabis, demonized by the government propaganda machine as marijuana. He and his friend, with a withered arm, reported seeing an older teenager with a bag of dope. The 20-something teacher nervously thanked the two 11-year-olds for letting him know, and told them both to just forget about it. Steve was shocked to see no further investigation. It would not occur to him for several decades that his teacher, as many in his generation, probably smoked cannabis, and was probably receiving a little delivery from the teenager just reported. It was after this dissociative encounter that Steve resolved within himself to never use any drugs of any description. And, until he was 38 years old, Steve stayed straight edge, with the exception of the occasional beer. Steve's only addiction might be described as compulsive inventing. One night at dinner, Steve asked Joe why a car couldn't have a simple electric battery and motor. Joe replied that the battery would go quickly dead. Otherwise, Steve's idea would work. Steve then pointed out that since the regular car's battery is recharged by the running of the engine, then perhaps an electric car could run on a bigger battery for a while, and then run the car on a gas internal combustion engine to recharge the battery. Steve made it clear he was seriously interested in this idea. Joe told Steve he would think about it for a while and get back to him with his answer. A few days later, Joe mentioned to his son that he thought Steve's idea a good one, and could not see any reason it wouldn't work. 40 years later, this would describe the typical hybrid automobile of 2018. On some rare occasions, Steve noticed that certain young male bulls would attempt to have sex with other young bulls, and yet seemed to ignore female cows. He watched a few unique members of different species of animals that did the same. When Steve asked his old daddy about this, he told his young son not to think about gearboxes and queers, and to never talk about it. He commanded the same as when he caught Steve masturbating at 5 years old through his blue jeans by standing on the second topmost rung of a corral fence and raising and lowering himself against the top board. Steve told himself something which as an educated adult would come out. Open sexuality is fine and normal for all the animals around us. Most people are happy whenever they see animals expressing their sexualities. But it is a dirty, nasty, wrongful thing, never to be done or mentioned by us people, who are definitely not animals. Homosexuality is something that only animals do. This was the genesis of Steve's sexual addiction. This dirty, secret view of sex became Steve's personal secret obsession by the age of 11. That is when he began to regularly masturbate, as most people do when puberty arrives, and yes, most certainly for intersex people as well. Masturbation became Steve's primary form of self-medicating abuse, the drug being produced by a gland in his brain. Some of Steve's sex drive was amplified due to having 2 full sets of gonads, both male and female. Thus, he was hormonally oversexed. Steve had to figure it out himself. There was no one to help him. His parents always claimed everything was fine. When Steve was 13 years old, he fell in love with Donnie. In Steve's eyes, he was unlike anyone he'd ever met. So few people could truly connect with Steve, but Donnie instantly clicked with him the first time they met. Steve was not sexually attracted to Donnie, but in puppy love they were. They did not kiss. They talked nonstop about women's bodies and exchanged oral sex. Mostly the two petted for a minute between hours of roughhouse wrestling and punching each other silly. They had sleepovers where they stayed busy building model cars and talking about girls. The parents slept unaware as the 2 boys slipped out a bedroom window. The 2 young teens ran wild and silent through the night in the remoteness of the country. They tried drinking whiskey, smoking cigarettes, and masturbating each other to straight porn magazines Donnie stole from his father's giant pile of magazines. One late summer night on the ranch in Steve's bedroom, Donnie shook him awake and handed him his clothes. They slipped out and ran for miles under full blue moonlight, howling like wolves as they raced over cow pastures. Miles from anyone, they stripped naked and ran chasing each other in the blue light of the moon, wrestling like wolverines and both declaring that they felt powerful, that this was their true selves. Steve awoke a bit and felt invincible on those nights. In his old age, Steve could see with clarity that he/she was a person who falls in love with the people that he/she falls in love with. Gender seemed beside the point. It was in old age that Steve knew, without any doubt, that he/she was intersex. Steve was diagnosed in 1969 by a medical doctor. After choosing to accept this fact, Steve knew himself and herself to be a sexually straight male and a lesbian female. It was as if fraternal twins grew interleaved at the cellular level, together instead of as separate twins. Anything is possible. In Steve's life, by the time he was in his 40s, he had fallen in love with 3 other males and 7 females, 2 women of which Steve married. Steve loved who he/she loved. Sometimes that had been a male, but usually became a problem when it came to sexual expression, because Steve was only sexually aroused by women. Steve grew to fully embrace this, yet another complexity in his identity. While his peers were busy partying, drinking, and smoking weed, 17-year-old Steve was staying home, taking care of his mother, his little brother, and himself. He never tried cannabis until he was tricked into using it in his late 30s. And then he was very glad he had been thus tricked. He found the herb quite helpful, as many autistic people do. Joe had a hard time dealing with his son's eccentricities. Steve often woke up screaming, crying, or even rigidly mute, unable to utter a sound, after having what he described as premonition dreams. Rosie expressed confusion over Steve's dreams to Joe or anyone else. Privately, she whispered to Steve memories of such dreams, and even revealed a couple of her own premonitions that she could still clearly remember. Joe tried to encourage his sons with stories, often gruesome, wary tales of the Wild West. Some stories came from his memories of Old Zino. Joe repeated stories of Old Zino to his family. He told the story of the freeze cat, as he would sometimes later call it. Zino once told me, when I was still a niño, one very cold winter night, I slipped out of our house to wander in the night. We lived on a hacienda near Las Cruces. I wandered to a little roadside tavern, only a shack on the highway a few miles off. I saw 2 very drunk hombres outside, and they could barely stand up. One was cussing the other one out. While the first one was still yelling, the second one bent down and picked up a dead cat that was lying against the side of the shack. It was freezing, so the cat was hard as a furry ball bat. He hit the guy yelling at him hard on both sides of the head. He went down like a sack of melons. Joe chuckled. Then a minute later he jumped up, pulled out a knife, and he yelled, "You hit me with the freeze cat! Now I kill you!" He jumped on the other hombre and cut his throat. The hombre spit on the dying man, cleaned his knife off on the guy's pant legs, and then walked away, Joe finished. After telling me the story, he got very serious and told me quietly, "El gato es mala suerte, creo," which just means the old man was superstitious about cats, I guess, Joe said.